A man starved his orphaned niece for months. Then a K-9 broke into his basement and exposed his cruelty. In the heart of a quaint, close-knit town, a dark secret lurked beneath the surface. The community, known for its warmth and resilience, was unaware of the cruelty that festered within the walls of Gerald Blake's estate. Gerald, a cold and feared man, had long used intimidation and manipulation to maintain his grip on power, inherited from his late brother's untimely passing. Lena, Gerald's orphaned niece, had once been a bright and hopeful child. However, since being left in her uncle's care, her light had slowly begun to fade. Hidden away in the damp, musty basement of Gerald's home, Lena suffered months of neglect and starvation, her existence unknown to the outside world. Officer Daniel Reyes, a dedicated K-9 officer, had always sensed something amiss in the town. His loyal companion, Shadow, a brilliant and intuitive German shepherd, often reacted strangely when they patrolled near Gerald's property. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was happening behind closed doors. As the sun rose over the town, casting a warm glow on the quaint houses and vibrant gardens, the residents began their daily routines, unaware of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. Little did they know that their lives were about to be forever changed by the actions of one cruel man and the bravery of an unexpected hero. Lena huddled in the corner of the damp, cold basement, her frail body shivering as she wrapped her arms around her knees. The only light came from a small, dusty window high above her, barely illuminating the room. She couldn't remember the last time she had seen the sun or felt its warmth on her skin. Her once vibrant eyes, now dull and sunken, stared blankly at the concrete walls that surrounded her. The only sounds were the occasional creaks and groans of the old house above and the scurrying of rats in the shadows. Lena's mind drifted to memories of her parents, their loving smiles and warm embraces now nothing more than distant dreams. She longed for the comfort of her mother's arms and the reassuring words of her father, but they were gone, leaving her alone in this nightmare. Upstairs, Gerald sat in his study, surrounded by the opulence of his late brother's estate. He sipped a glass of expensive whiskey, his cold eyes scanning the documents before him. He had no regard for the suffering child locked away beneath his feet, seeing her as nothing more than a burden, a reminder of the family he despised. As the town bustled with life outside, Lena's existence remained a secret, her cries for help unheard, her suffering unknown. But little did Gerald know that the winds of change were about to blow through the town, and his reign of cruelty was about to be challenged by an unlikely hero. Officer Daniel Reyes patrolled the streets of the town, his K-9 partner, Shadow, by his side. The German shepherd's keen senses were always on high alert, ready to detect any signs of danger or distress. As they neared Gerald Blake's property, Shadow suddenly became agitated. His ears perked up, and his body tensed. Daniel noticed his partner's unusual behavior and felt a sense of unease wash over him. He had always suspected that something was not quite right with Gerald, but he had never been able to prove it. The man was a master manipulator, always managing to evade suspicion and maintain his grip on power. As they walked past the sprawling estate, Shadow let out a low, menacing growl, his eyes fixed on the house. Daniel knew better than to ignore his partner's instincts. He made a mental note to keep a closer eye on Gerald and his activities. Meanwhile, inside the house, Lena's stomach growled painfully, reminding her of the hunger that gnawed at her constantly. She couldn't remember the last time she had eaten a proper meal. Gerald would occasionally toss her scraps from his own meals, but they were never enough to satisfy her growing hunger. She had tried to escape once, months ago, when Gerald had forgotten to lock the basement door. However, her weakened state and fear of the unknown had prevented her from making it far. Gerald had caught her and punished her severely, ensuring that she would never attempt to flee again. As the sun began to set over the town, casting long shadows across the streets, Daniel and Shadow returned to the police station, their minds heavy with the day's events. Little did they know that their suspicions would soon be confirmed, and they would play a crucial role in exposing the cruelty that had been hidden for so long. The community, once blissfully unaware of the darkness that lurked within its midst, began to sense that something was amiss. Small, seemingly insignificant details started to catch their attention, like pieces of a puzzle slowly coming together. Mrs. Hanson, the elderly lady who lived next door to Gerald, noticed that she never saw any children coming or going from the house. She had always assumed that Gerald lived alone, but recently, she could have sworn she heard the faint sound of a child's cry coming from the basement. Mr. Thompson, the owner of the local grocery store, realized that Gerald never bought any food or supplies that would be suitable for a child. He had always found Gerald to be an odd and intimidating man, but this realization made him feel uneasy. As these small observations began to circulate among the townspeople, a sense of unease and suspicion grew. They had always known Gerald to be a cold and feared man, but could he be capable of something truly sinister? Officer Daniel Reyes, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, began to investigate further. He started to ask questions carefully and discreetly, trying to gather any information that could shed light on the situation. Meanwhile, Lena remained trapped in her dark, lonely world, unaware that the truth of her suffering was slowly coming to light. She clung to the faint hope that someday, someone would find her and rescue her from this nightmare. As the tension in the town continued to rise, the stage was set for a confrontation that would shatter the silence and expose the cruelty that had been hidden for so long. The community, once passive and fearful, was about to be galvanized into action by the bravery of a few determined individuals. Officer Daniel Reyes sat at his desk, poring over the limited information he had managed to gather about Gerald Blake. The more he dug, the more convinced he became that something sinister was happening behind the walls of the Blake estate. He had spoken to several neighbors who had reported hearing strange noises coming from the house, particularly from the basement area. Some even claimed to have heard what sounded like a child's cries, but they had been too afraid to investigate further. Daniel knew he needed more concrete evidence before he could take any official action. He decided to take a closer look at the property himself, hoping to find something that could confirm his suspicions. As he and Shadow approached the estate, the German Shepherd once again became agitated, his hackles raising as he stared intently at the house. Daniel took note of his partner's behavior and proceeded cautiously. He walked around the perimeter of the property, looking for any signs of unusual activity. As he neared the back of the house, he noticed a small, partially hidden window that appeared to lead to the basement. The window was dirty and cracked, but Daniel could have sworn he saw a flicker of movement behind the glass. His heart racing, Daniel knew he needed to find a way to get inside and investigate further. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone, possibly a child, was in danger and needed his help. Meanwhile, inside the basement, Lena huddled in the corner, her eyes wide with fear as she heard the sound of footsteps above her. She prayed that it wasn't Gerald, coming to punish her for some perceived transgression. As the footsteps grew closer, Lena's heart pounded in her chest. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the worst, unaware that help was closer than she ever could have imagined. The town, once content to turn a blind eye to the darkness that lurked within its midst, began to stir with a newfound sense of purpose. The small, seemingly insignificant clues that had emerged over the past few weeks had slowly chipped away at the wall of silence and fear that Gerald Blake had so carefully constructed. Whispers began to circulate among the townspeople, each person adding their own piece to the puzzle. Mrs. Hanson, the elderly neighbor, spoke of the child's cries she had heard coming from the basement. Mr. Thompson, the grocery store owner, shared his concerns about Gerald's lack of food purchases for a child. As the evidence mounted, the community began to rally together, united in their determination to uncover the truth. They knew that they could no longer stand idly by while an innocent child suffered. Officer Daniel Reyes, bolstered by the support of the community, intensified his investigation. He reached out to his colleagues at the police department, urging them to take action. He shared his suspicions about Gerald and the strange behavior of his K-9 partner, Shadow, whenever they were near the Blake property. Meanwhile, Shadow's agitation grew with each passing day. The loyal German Shepherd could sense the suffering and despair emanating from the basement, and he was determined to find a way to help. Inside the basement, Lena clung to the faint hope that someone, anyone, would find her. She had long since given up on the idea of escape, her spirit broken by months of neglect and cruelty. But as the sounds of the outside world began to filter through the cracks in the walls, she dared to dream that maybe, just maybe, her nightmare was coming to an end. As the town and its protectors closed in on the truth, Gerald Blake grew increasingly desperate. He knew that his carefully crafted facade was crumbling, and he would stop at nothing to maintain his grip on power. But even he could not foresee the chain of events that was about to unfold, events that would lead to his downfall and the liberation of the innocent child he had so cruelly imprisoned. Officer Daniel Reyes stood before the Blake estate, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. He knew that he was about to confront a man who had long been feared and respected in the community, a man who had used his power and influence to hide his cruelty from the world. But Daniel also knew that he had the support of the entire town behind him. In the days leading up to this moment, the community had come together in a way that he had never seen before. They had shared their stories, their suspicions, and their determination to see justice served. As he approached the front door, Shadow by his side, Daniel could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever lay ahead. Inside the house, Gerald Blake paced back and forth, his mind racing with possibilities. He had always been a master manipulator, able to twist any situation to his advantage. But now, as the walls of his carefully constructed world began to crumble around him, he felt a sense of desperation that he had never known before. He glanced towards the basement door, behind which Lena lay huddled in the darkness. He had always seen her as a burden, a reminder of the family he despised. But now, as the truth of his actions threatened to come to light, he realized that she was also his greatest liability. Gerald's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, forceful knock at the door. He froze, his heart racing as he realized that the moment he had been dreading had finally arrived. Outside, Daniel waited, his hand resting on Shadow's head. He could feel the tension radiating from his partner, a reflection of his own nerves. But he also felt a sense of purpose, a determination to see this through to the end. As the seconds ticked by, the silence broken only by the sound of his own breathing, Daniel knew that he was standing on the precipice of something momentous. He knew that the next few moments would determine the fate of an innocent child and the future of an entire community. And so, with a final, steadying breath, he raised his hand and knocked once more, ready to face whatever lay behind the door. The sound of the knock echoed through the house, like a drumbeat of justice that could no longer be ignored. Gerald Blake stood frozen, his mind racing as he tried to calculate his next move. He knew that he couldn't let them find Lena, couldn't let them see the evidence of his cruelty. He had to find a way to get rid of her, to make her disappear before it was too late. With a sudden burst of desperate energy, Gerald raced down the stairs, his footsteps pounding on the wooden floor. He flung open the basement door, his eyes wild as he scanned the darkness for his niece. Lena, startled by the sudden intrusion, cowered in the corner, her eyes wide with fear. She had never seen her uncle like this before, so frantic and unhinged. Gerald grabbed her by the arm, his grip tight enough to bruise. "Get up," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "We have to go now." Lena stumbled to her feet, her weakened body barely able to support her weight. She had no idea what was happening, but she could sense the urgency in her uncle's voice. As Gerald dragged her up the stairs, Lena's eyes flickered to the front door, where the sound of knocking had grown louder and more insistent. For a moment, she felt a flicker of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, someone had come to save her. But then Gerald was pulling her towards the back of the house, towards a door that she had never seen before. He flung it open, revealing a dark, narrow passageway that seemed to lead nowhere. "Go," he ordered, shoving her forward. "Don't make a sound, and don't come back until I tell you to." Lena hesitated, her heart pounding with fear. She didn't want to go into the darkness, didn't want to leave the only hope she had ever known. But then Gerald was raising his hand, his eyes flashing with a rage that she knew all too well. And so, with a final, desperate glance towards the front door, Lena stepped into the passageway, her bare feet cold against the damp earth. She had no idea where she was going, no idea what lay ahead. All she knew was that she had to keep moving, had to find a way to survive. Behind her, Gerald slammed the door shut, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He knew that he had bought himself some time, but he also knew that it wouldn't last forever. Sooner or later, the truth would come out, and he would have to face the consequences of his actions. But for now, all he could do was wait, his heart pounding with a fear that he had never known before. Officer Daniel Reyes stood outside the Blake estate, his frustration mounting with each unanswered knock. He knew that Gerald was inside, could feel it in his gut, but he also knew that he couldn't just barge in without probable cause. Beside him, Shadow whined, his nose pressed to the ground as he sniffed the air. Daniel could sense his partner's agitation, could feel the tension radiating from his furry body. And then, suddenly, Shadow let out a sharp bark, his head snapping towards the side of the house. Daniel followed his gaze, his eyes narrowing as he spotted a small, partially hidden door that he had never noticed before. Without hesitation, he raced towards the door, Shadow bounding ahead of him. He could hear the sound of footsteps from inside the house, could sense the desperate energy that seemed to crackle through the air. As he reached the door, Daniel paused, his hand hovering over the handle. He knew that he was about to cross a line, knew that he was about to enter into uncharted territory. But he also knew that he had no choice, knew that he had to do whatever it took to save the innocent child who he believed was trapped inside. With a deep breath, Daniel turned the handle, the door swinging open with a creak that seemed to echo through the stillness of the afternoon. Inside, he found himself in a dark, narrow passageway, the walls damp and musty. He could hear the sound of footsteps up ahead, could sense the desperation in their pace. And then, suddenly, he heard a sound that made his heart stop, a sound that he knew he would never forget. It was the sound of a child's whimper, weak and broken, but unmistakable in the stillness of the passageway. Daniel raced forward, Shadow bounding ahead of him, his ears perked and his nose twitching. They followed the sound of the whimper, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. And then, suddenly, they burst into a small, dimly lit room, and Daniel felt his breath catch in his throat at the sight before him. There, huddled in the corner, was Lena, her thin body trembling with fear and exhaustion. Her eyes were wide and haunted, her skin pale and bruised. But even in her weakened state, there was a flicker of hope in her eyes, a sense that maybe, just maybe, her nightmare was finally coming to an end. Daniel rushed forward, his arms outstretched, but Lena flinched away, her body tensing with fear. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice gentle and reassuring. "I'm here to help you. You're safe now." Slowly, hesitantly, Lena reached out, her small hand trembling as she grasped Daniel's fingers. And in that moment, something shifted, a sense of hope and possibility that seemed to fill the room like a breath of fresh air. Behind them, Shadow stood guard, his ears perked and his body tense, ready to protect the innocent child who had suffered for so long. And in the distance, the sound of sirens began to fill the air, a promise of justice and retribution that would soon be fulfilled. The town watched in stunned silence as Gerald Blake was led out of his house in handcuffs, his face a mask of rage and defeat. The man who had once seemed so powerful, so untouchable, now looked small and pathetic in the grip of the law. But even as they watched him being taken away, the townspeople's thoughts were elsewhere, focused on the small, fragile child who had been rescued from the darkness of the basement. Lena was rushed to the hospital, her body weak and malnourished from months of neglect and abuse. But even as she lay in the sterile white bed, surrounded by beeping machines and concerned faces, there was a flicker of life in her eyes, a sense of hope that had been absent for so long. The doctors and nurses worked tirelessly to heal her physical wounds, to nourish her body and ease her pain. But they knew that the true healing would take much longer, that the scars left by Gerald's cruelty ran deep and would not be easily erased. In the days and weeks that followed, The town rallied around Lena, offering their support and love in any way they could. They brought her gifts and cards, sat by her bedside and read her stories, did everything they could to show her that she was not alone, that she was loved and valued and cherished. And slowly, day by day, Lena began to heal. Her body grew stronger, her cheeks filling out and her eyes brightening with each passing day. But more than that, her spirit began to mend, the broken pieces of her heart slowly knitting themselves back together. She learned to trust again, to open herself up to the love and kindness of those around her. She learned that the world was not always a dark and cruel place, that there was beauty and goodness to be found if only she had the courage to look for it. And as she healed, the town healed with her, the scars left by Gerald's cruelty slowly fading away, replaced by a sense of unity and purpose that had been absent for so long. They had been through a nightmare, had witnessed the depths of human cruelty and suffered the consequences of their own inaction. But they had also learned the power of love and compassion, the strength that could be found in coming together and standing up for what was right. And so, as Lena took her first tentative steps out of the hospital, her hand clasped tightly in Daniel's, the town watched with tears in their eyes and hope in their hearts, ready to embrace the future that lay ahead. The sun was setting over the town, casting a warm, golden glow over the streets and houses. In a small, cozy house on the outskirts of town, Lena sat on the front porch, her eyes fixed on the horizon. It had been 6 months since she had been rescued from the darkness of Gerald's basement. 6 months since her life had been irrevocably changed. In that time, she had come to live with Daniel and his wife, Sarah, who had opened their hearts and their home to her without hesitation. At first, Lena had been afraid, unsure of how to navigate this new world of love and kindness. But Daniel and Sarah had been patient and understanding, giving her the space and support she needed to heal and grow. They had enrolled her in school, where she had thrived under the guidance of kind and nurturing teachers. They had taken her to therapy, where she had learned to process the trauma of her past and build a foundation for a brighter future. And most of all, they had loved her, unconditionally and without reservation, showing her that family was not always defined by blood, but by the bonds of the heart. As Lena watched the sun dip below the horizon, she felt a sense of peace wash over her, a feeling of belonging that she had never known before. She knew that the road ahead would not always be easy, that there would be challenges and obstacles to overcome. But she also knew that she was not alone, that she had a family and a community that would stand by her side, no matter what. And in that moment, as the last rays of sunlight faded away and the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Lena knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Inside the house, Daniel and Sarah watched from the window, their hearts full of love and pride for the remarkable young girl who had become such an integral part of their lives. They knew that they had been given a gift, a chance to make a difference in the life of a child who had suffered so much. And as they watched Lena stand up and make her way inside, her head held high and a smile on her face, they knew that they would do everything in their power to help her build a life filled with love, happiness, and endless possibility. The town square was bustling with activity, the air filled with the sounds of laughter and chatter. It was a beautiful spring day, the sun shining brightly in a clear blue sky, and the community had come together to celebrate. In the center of the square stood a small stage, draped in colorful ribbons and balloons. And on that stage, her face beaming with pride and joy, stood Lena, a microphone clasped tightly in her hand. It had been 2 years since she had been rescued from the darkness of Gerald's basement. 2 years since her life had been given a second chance. And in that time, she had blossomed into a confident, caring young woman, a leader in her community and an inspiration to all who knew her. She had started a support group for children who had experienced trauma and abuse, using her own story as a beacon of hope and resilience. She had volunteered at the local animal shelter, finding solace and companionship in the furry creatures who had also known the pain of neglect and abandonment. And now, as she stood before her friends and neighbors, her voice strong and clear, she knew that she had found her purpose, her calling in life. "I stand before you today not as a victim, but as a survivor," she said, her eyes shining with emotion. I stand before you as living proof that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope, always a chance for a better tomorrow. The crowd erupted in applause, their faces filled with admiration and respect for the young woman who had overcome so much. And as Lena looked out at the sea of faces, she felt a sense of gratitude wash over her, a deep appreciation for the love and support that had brought her to this moment. She knew that she would never forget the pain of her past, the scars that Gerald's cruelty had left on her heart and soul. But she also knew that those scars had made her stronger, had given her a unique perspective and a deep empathy for others who had suffered. And as she stepped down from the stage, her hand clasped tightly in Daniel's, she knew that she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, ready to continue on the path of healing and growth that had brought her so far. For Lena, the future was bright, full of endless possibility and hope, and she knew that no matter what obstacles she might face, she would always have the love and support of her family and her community, the strength and resilience that had carried her through the darkest of times. The old Blake estate stood silent and empty, a haunting reminder of the darkness that had once lurked within its walls. But as the sun began to set over the town, casting a warm, golden glow over the streets and houses, a small group of people gathered outside the gates, their faces filled with determination and purpose. At the head of the group stood Lena, her eyes fixed on the imposing structure before her. She had not been back to this place since the day she had been rescued, had not dared to confront the memories and emotions that still lingered in the shadows. But now, surrounded by her family and friends, she knew that it was time to face her fears, to reclaim the power that Gerald had once stolen from her. With a deep breath, she pushed open the gates and stepped inside, her footsteps echoing on the cracked and overgrown path. The others followed close behind, their presence a comforting reminder that she was not alone. As they made their way towards the house, Lena felt a sense of unease wash over her, a flicker of the old fear that had once consumed her. But she pushed it aside, focusing instead on the love and support that surrounded her, the strength and resilience that had brought her to this moment. And then, as they reached the front door, Lena saw something that made her heart skip a beat. There, etched into the weathered wood, was a small, simple message, a testament to the power of hope and transformation. From darkness, light; from despair, hope; from cruelty, kindness. This place, once a symbol of suffering, shall now be a beacon of healing and renewal. Lena felt tears spring to her eyes as she read the words, a sense of overwhelming emotion washing over her. She knew that the journey ahead would not be easy, that there would be challenges and obstacles to overcome. But she also knew that she was not alone, that she had the love and support of her family and her community, the strength and resilience that had carried her through the darkest of times. And so, with a smile on her face and hope in her heart, Lena pushed open the door and stepped inside, ready to begin the next chapter of her life, ready to transform the old Blake estate into a place of healing and renewal, a symbol of the power of love and compassion to overcome even the darkest of evils. The sun was setting over the town, casting a warm, golden glow over the streets and houses. In the heart of the community, a small group of people gathered, their faces filled with joy and celebration. It had been 5 years since Lena had been rescued from the darkness of Gerald's basement. 5 years since her life had been given a second chance. And in that time, she had accomplished more than she ever could have imagined.